Welcome back, Weeers and Weeboos, to a bit of a different video. Whatever the game plays in the background, it's not related to the topic because the topic is Deltarune, and I don't think Deltarune gameplay with no sound in the background is going to be all that engaging. So anyway, as you can probably tell by the title, today we're going to talk about everyone's favorite Deltarune character. Right? This is everyone's favorite Deltarune character. There can be no other. He's the only one. Ralsei. I mean, come on, we all love Ralsei. This is actually a video I made ages ago, but at some point I unlisted it because that older video came out very rambly and just not very well made. It was made as a sort of, I don't have a video this week, let me do a more casual, just talking video, and yeah, it didn't come out very good. This one I'm going to put a bit more effort into making more coherent. I also had much less to talk about on that one. This one I got a lot more to talk about. Funnily enough, the fact that I'm releasing this video as my very next video, like as soon as I change my profile picture to Ralsei after having it as a doge for ages, is actually basically a complete coincidence, but good timing, I guess. Anyway, let's get to the point. I'm not gonna lie, this is not a video I thought I would be remaking at any point, because a lot of this video is trying to make the assertion that we really can't definitively say just about anything about who or what Ralsei is at the moment with just the first two chapters we have from Deltarune, which might sound like an uncontroversial statement. However, there's a lot of things the community takes as fact already, which if you disagree with, you do tend to get quite a lot of backlash. This used to sort of be true with the Ralsei is evil theory, but that certainly has died down now. Not that you don't still hear about it sometimes, but I feel like most of the community kind of agreed, well, it's not impossible, but like, let's be real, like, it's not super likely. We don't have enough to say that he isn't just doing something suspicious, but isn't necessarily evil yet. However, there's another theory about Ralsei which I'm gonna have to challenge for the point of this video, and that is the idea that Ralsei cannot be Asriel. There's a certain video online that I'm sure that you're all aware of, because, I mean, it's certainly circulated around quite a lot, that is supposed to be a debunking of the idea that Asriel could be Ralsei, and I've seen this video linked to me a good amount of times, I've heard it brought up enough times, and I obviously thought that it must have a pretty damn good argument if, in fact, it really did debunk it, and so many people were citing it as, like, the explanation of, oh, this is why you're all wrong. And I remember I watched it ages ago for the first time, and I don't really remember much from it, but I remember thinking, well, that wasn't very good, but I never really thought much more about it because I quickly forgot about it, and I thought maybe I was just mad in the moment. Maybe, you know, when I come back to it now, after quite a lot more time has passed, I'll look at it with clearer eyes and be like, oh, fair enough. Because I was starting to get a bit concerned maybe I was wrong, because, well, so much of the community seemed to go along with this that I thought maybe there was some more subtle evidence they brought up in the video that I forgot about or skipped over. And I have watched many playthroughs of the games and do keep a sharp eye out for details because I love that kind of lore stuff. But in fairness, especially since I haven't played the games myself, well, I started, but yeah, again, not done with it. I thought maybe there is some obscure thing I'm missing. Maybe there's just this one interaction when you try and give this one item to this one character where they say something that really reinforces the theory. But honestly, I'm starting to become convinced that there really isn't much evidence to support this theory, and it's just sort of become the popular narrative because it's what people want to believe is the easy answer. So I guess as much as I didn't want to be so direct, I feel like to even get to the main point of this video, I do have to sort of debunk the debunking video. I want to make it really clear to start that my stance is not that Asriel is Ralsei necessarily, more that we do not know enough to say either way. And while that might sound like a very nothing stance, I do have some things I do believe are likely the case with Ralsei at the moment, although I obviously acknowledge they're not fact. And I do think it is more important than it sounds to say that we don't know yet, because people act like we do, and it shuts down a lot of conversation, and people unironically get toxic over this really stupid shit. Like, personally, I've been in the Undertale and Deltarune communities for a really long time, and despite what you hear about them, at least in my experience, I've had a really good time overall. I've found most of the community absolutely just super pleasant. Yeah, they can be sometimes annoying. What a surprise, it's a fandom. They're all adorable. And certainly, at least from the main Undertale Deltarune fandoms, my personal experience, the only time I've really seen them acting outright kind of toxic is to people who try to say that they think that Asriel is Ralsei, and it just seems so weirdly uncalled for and out of nowhere. I mean, even if they were right, I don't think the way that a lot of people act when they see someone saying that they think Asriel is Ralsei is very defensible. But, I mean, hey, I kinda don't think they're right, so let's get to that. So yeah, I promise I'm not gonna make this video a beef with the creator of this video, because honestly, I don't think they have any negative intentions here. I think they really are just saying their opinion. I just think their opinion isn't incorrect, but I think that debunking was definitely a strong word to use in their title, considering what they present. So you might have thought that this video would have raised a lot of hard evidence points of reasons why Asriel cannot be Ralsei if it was 15 minutes long. But actually, most of the video is dedicated to much more situational and sort of it suggests they aren't the same kind of evidence. Now, I'm not saying that that isn't valid, but I think it does instantly set off a red flag to me that they're trying to present this as a full, like, debunk. It can't even be possible that this theory is true. And most of the evidence we're leading with is, oh, well, are Asriel and Ralsei really alike? They don't really act the same. Which already, even then, I kind of have a contention with that point. I would agree that Ralsei and Asriel don't act exactly the same. While they might be princes, they might be caring, they might be, you know, soft boys, whatever. They might have a lot of similar traits. I do agree that there are some things that aren't exactly the same, but a lot of these things are pretty weak. The main points they bring up is the idea that Asriel is considered a crybaby in Undertale, whereas we haven't seen Ralsei be a crybaby in Deltarune. But I think that's more because, well, Ralsei hasn't had any reason to cry yet. I mean, I don't know if he is a crybaby or not. We haven't really seen that trait demonstrated, but we also haven't really seen a situation where if he did have that trait, we would see it. So I feel already that's quite a weak one, and that's one trait that doesn't match when many others do. It could even just be explained by the fact that Ralsei is clearly an older version of Asriel if he is Asriel. Maybe he simply got a bit more mature. The other point seems stronger at first until you consider it in context. That being that in the true pacifist ending of Undertale, the whole reason why Asriel is fighting you and trying to kill you is because then you'll have to reload your save and fight him again. And if you can never beat him, then you can never leave the game. And if you ever leave the game, you'll be leaving him alone forever. Because he has determination, he won't be able to die, which means that eventually he'll get to the point where he knows what everyone will say at every single turn, and so people will stop becoming people to him. You're the only person he could still have a conversation with and actually not be able to predict what you would do each time because you can save too. So of course Asriel wants you to stick around because literally, as far as he's concerned, you are the only person in his world who is a real person. Everyone in there will stop being real people to him the second that he goes back to being Flowey. So I think it's pretty understandable why Asriel is so desperate for you to not leave in Undertale, and I feel like it's really weak to compare that to how Ralsei acts in Deltarune. Yes, Ralsei does not act the same way. He seems happy to let you leave the Dark World and says, oh, I'll make you some yummy cakes when you come back or whatever. However, this is a completely different situation. It's not like Ralsei is going to be left alone in a world where there's no real people around him the second you leave, like it was the case for Asriel. Not to mention, I feel like another reason why comparing him to Asriel in the first place is a weak piece of evidence is because I honestly would even argue we don't know a lot about Asriel in Undertale, at least their personality. I mean, sure, we can tell they're a bit like soft-spoken, kind, you know, a bit of a crybaby, blah, blah, blah. But like beyond that, do we really know much? He does not get a lot of screen time, and most of what we do hear from him is just a little bits and pieces from other people. So I don't necessarily think that we can definitively say we know how Asriel acts, really. Especially not enough to say it debunks a theory which has a lot of other reasons it could be quite true. But of course, I'm leading with just the first thing they covered in there. It's not that they don't have any evidence. In fact, you know what, I'll jump ahead straight to the main thing I'm sure most people are thinking right now who defend the theory, because this is the closest thing the theory has to any actual objective proof that, oh, well, this isn't even a, like, interpretation thing, this proves it. And that being, in Deltarune, if you didn't notice, all the Darkners always have coloured dialogue portraits, and all the Lightners don't. However, Ralsei has a coloured dialogue portrait, meaning he is a Darkner. Of course, Asriel would be a Lightner, so they can't be the same person, right? And I definitely think this is the strongest piece of evidence this theory has going for it. And I will say, I don't have a way to disprove that piece of evidence. However, I have a piece of counter-evidence which is a bit unrelated, but you'll see why I'm bringing it up now. I'll tie it back. There's one very interesting detail I noticed straight away on my first watch through of Chapter 2, which I know that other people have noticed, but I never hear people bring it back up, even though it's been a while, and I feel like we never really came up with any sort of answers to this. Chapter 2 takes place in a completely different dark world. There is no way to access this other dark world from the dark world that Ralsei is in as far as we're aware. As well as that, Ralsei doesn't know we're going into this other dark world because we're in the light world and we didn't even know we were going to go in there beforehand. So how on earth does 1, Ralsei even get here, and 2, how does he know we're here? If Ralsei truly is a Darkner with no special abilities or anything like that, then this is impossible. I also completely forgot to mention that on top of all that, Ralsei should have turned into a statue like Lancer did if he is just a normal Darkner, and yet he doesn't. However, if Ralsei was secretly Asriel, that's actually very possible. He would have simply followed them around in the light world and followed in after them. That would explain where he came from, why he was a little bit late, how he got there, and how he knew you were there. And the only question that I hear from people who try and contend this point is, how would Ralsei do that without being spotted? Everyone around town knows him. And I feel like this is a pretty obvious answer. We saw that Ralsei can give himself that black fur in Chapter 1, and I don't think people would recognize him as the black fur Ralsei compared to the white fur Asriel. It's certainly possible that he simply puts on that different coloured fur and the hat and all that with a different appearance and then follows them in, and no one knows who they are. Now, I know that this is a bit of a long tangent. You're probably thinking, okay, how does this relate back to the last point? Well, here we have a situation where both theories have some kind of contradictory evidence which seemingly completely disproves the other. These can't be both true. You see, part of what even inspired me to make this video is I did have a thankfully much more civil conversation recently than a lot of the previous ones I've had with someone who was posting that video saying, I don't even know why people still think that Ralsei is Asriel or whatever. And when I asked, how is this possible? Their response was, well, maybe there's some kind of special Darkner with some sort of special power that lets them see and go into other worlds. And I actually agree that that isn't impossible, but I feel like this is the problem. That is equally, if not more absurd than the idea that Ralsei might just be either a Lightner who has a coloured portrait unlike the others, or maybe a Lightner with the power to give himself a Darkner's coloured portrait. Again, it sounds kind of absurd at first, but when you look at the alternative, no matter which way you go, you've got to make some kind of absurd assumption for this to all make sense. And that's again why, as a reminder, my position here isn't that the Asriel is Ralsei theory is definitely true. It's that the fact that it's dismissed outright with very, very little evidence, I feel is unfair to it. Again, I'm not saying it's the true theory that we should all follow, more that I feel like we shouldn't treat it like one theory is the established, this is how it is, there are no other theories that are valid, this is the only one. If you don't have this theory, it's time to get the fucking bandwagon to attack you. I don't know. People get really aggressive over this for some reason. Hey, it's future me, from the future, where I'm editing the vidya. Alright, get ready for an extremely long, not very high production value segment because I completely missed that there is a pinned comment on the video I'm talking about, which I did not see until now. This pinned comment brings up 4 further points to help reinforce their argument. However, I have to say that this didn't really change my mind about making this video. I was a bit worried at first, like, oh shit, have I been doing this for nothing? Are they actually going to have some really good evidence to clap back with? But, nah, I'm not going to lie. I feel like they made 1 decent point here and 3 points which, if anything, in trying to scramble for a defense, it kind of seems like they're, if anything, making their theory sound worse. So I guess, for the sake of being charitable here, I will present what I think is their best piece of evidence that they added to the theory so far. So I guess, in the spirit of being charitable, I think I should probably present first what I think their best argument is. And it's kind of funny, because if anything, it sounds like as they write it, this is the argument they were least confident in, but I actually think this is the strongest argument they have for their theory. That being, and I knew I'd forget something like this, that the Ralsei tea, I remembered the, character-flavoured, items in Deltarune which healed people based on their relationship with that character. It actually heals Chris the least. Now, I remembered that these things existed, but of course I didn't remember such a small detail. And I'll admit, that's actually quite a good point. And I think that this is the strongest piece of evidence, because even though they seem to acknowledge it's very circumstantial, I have to admit this is the only piece of evidence they bring forward where my only response I could give has to include a maybe. I do think there are very logical explanations for this, Maybe Chris doesn't like what Asriel has become in Ralsei, or maybe Chris doesn't know that Ralsei is Asriel and doesn't like that Ralsei reminds him of Asriel. Again, if the theory that Ralsei is Asriel ends up being true. But I have to admit that while those are both plausible arguments, they are both arguments I have to make with a maybe. So I actually think that's their strongest piece of evidence. The other three pieces of evidence they give, I don't think are that great. I'm kind of giving them in reverse order here, because I feel like all their later points are their better ones. They make the argument that Queen does not have a room for Ralsei in the second chapter, because she only has rooms for Lightners with search histories she could make the rooms from, and Ralsei is not a Lightner. However, there is a room for Asriel, which, I mean, they do bring up, but, like, I feel like this is a bit of a nothing point then, isn't it? Because does Queen know that Ralsei's Asriel? Probably not. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense that Ralsei isn't sent to Asriel's room if Ralsei and Asriel kind of look a little bit different, and Queen doesn't... I mean, does Queen even know what Asriel looks like? I don't even know if she would. So I feel like this is a bit of a nothing point, because I feel like it doesn't prove anything either way. The other 2 points, though, I feel like, if anything, make her argument look weaker. She acknowledges the fact that there is no explanation as to how, with her current theory, Ralsei could possibly know they were in the second chapter's Dark World and be able to get there. However, when they acknowledge this, they don't then prove how it is possible under their theory. They instead don't give an explanation for that and just proceed to say, well, your theory doesn't explain it either, which is kind of stupid, because again, I think that our theory does explain it. Which again, I think it's completely plausible for Asriel to simply have snuck in after you in disguise so that no one recognized him. Again, the black fur exists. I don't think anyone around town would recognize him as Asriel wearing the black fur that we see Ralsei in Chapter 1. And I really don't think this is that out there of an explanation. Even if he has no disguise, I still feel like this idea that, oh, no one would have seen him is a little bit hyperbolic. Like, yeah, I agree, if he had no disguise, maybe then it'd be a little bit less likely, but even then, you're not really proving it's not true. But the last point, again, is just another illustration of the lengths that people go to just to not have to challenge their own assumptions. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit more aggressive here, but the reason why is because I'm kind of matching the tone of the comment here. I mean, in fairness, when you have a video like this blow up, I imagine it probably does get very frustrating having to respond to all the comments, and I imagine a lot of them are saying the same thing that they've already had to read a million times over, so I guess maybe the frustration comes from there, but they do seem to be quite angry and very determined that they're right in this, pinned comment, and I don't know, I don't buy it. Anyway, their final point, which again I feel like is probably their weakest, is that actually it makes sense that Ralsei doesn't turn into a statue in the other Dark World because of the fact that Ralsei's fountain is made out of pure darkness, and apparently that magically means that he doesn't turn to stone in other Dark Worlds. Like, I'm willing to accept that idea. I think it's certainly plausible. There probably is a reason why his fountain is made out of pure darkness, and that's something the game feels the need to tell us. So I don't think it's impossible, but we don't know anything about what it means for a fountain to be made out of pure darkness, what that actually means for what it can do. We don't know that being made out of pure darkness means that you can go to another dark world and not get turned into a statue. That's just something you're pulling out your ass. And again, I wouldn't have a problem with it, considering the rest of the theory is pretty coherent, and hey, you know what? We have to make a few assumptions. Again, no theory fits in perfectly. I'd be fine with that if it was presented as an interpretation, but again, the creator of this video is trying pretty hard to present this pretty aggressively as the only idea that can be accepted. Again, I still don't necessarily hold it against him, because I'm guessing this increased aggressiveness in the tone is just as a result of probably getting a whole bunch of dipshit comments which just kind of set them off. But certainly, I gotta say, I do not agree with their points, and I don't think they made their argument much stronger with the points they raised here. Anyway, I'm sorry for that long aside. Back to the real video. The final argument that I feel was important to bring up in that video is the idea that it wouldn't make any sense for Asriel to want to leave his life in the light world and go into the dark world, because it seems like everyone liked him and his life was going well. So why would he possibly want to go live in the dark world where he's all alone and just waiting for someone to show up? Well, I'll get to that later. My answer to that is tied to what I feel a potential message of the game could be if the Asriel is Ralsei theory is true. And that's something that I'm leaving in a separate section later, but we will get back to that. Okay, so enough beating around the bush. I'm sure a few of you are rolling your eyes with me playing this on the fence shit where I'm like, oh, but they could all be true. I don't think any of them are wrong. And I want to make it clear, I do genuinely believe that, but I'm sure you would like to know what I personally think is the case. Because ultimately, I don't think I have the definitive answer, but let's be real, I'm going to have a bias. I'm going to have one theory I think is most likely to be true. And the theory that I subscribe to isn't the same as the Azrael is Ralsei theory, but it's certainly adjacent to it, so make of that what you will. But essentially, I feel like Ralsei isn't literally Azrael, but Ralsei is very clearly supposed to represent Azrael. I don't think the actual Azrael from the light world is coming into the dark world with everyone else and becoming Ralsei. But I do think that there's a very good chance that Chris might have some kind of keepsake that Azrael gave him or something like that on him, which then in the dark world manifests as Ralsei. That would also explain how they managed to follow him from the different dark worlds, despite supposedly not being able to know where they are, or get to them for that matter. Although I will admit, this theory is almost cheating a little bit, because since it is so vague, and since, magical, vague representation, it's a metaphor, there's a lot of ways you can fill in the gaps here. And I'm not denying that fact. I just think, surely you can probably agree it's reasonable to say that that is probably the most likely outcome. Maybe you don't agree, but you could at least see how that's a reasonable thing to think. That is the theory I think is the most likely. There are 3 other theories that I want to cover that I also could believe are true, but I don't believe in as strongly as the one I just said. I will admit, the one I believe in the second most is the idea that Azrael is Ralsei. I feel like there are a few things in the game that suggest this probably isn't the case, but there isn't enough to really say, oh, it's definitely not the case. And I do feel like, and again, I'll get to it later, there are a lot of thematic things that would make a lot of sense if Azrael is literally just Ralsei. The third one is something completely out of left field that honestly, I have not thought about in ages, and I'll say this, I don't actually think it's likely, but I thought I'd mention it because it's kind of interesting, and in fairness, I don't think it's impossible. So, fun fact, ages ago, and I mean ages ago, back when I first watched Deltarune for the first time, I was really confused at the reveal with Ralsei that, like, they look just like Azrael and they're probably Azrael or whatever, or at least derived from Azrael. And of course, at the time, I didn't instantly go, oh, Azrael. Especially because he doesn't look exactly the same as Azrael. Obviously, there's quite a strong resemblance, but Azrael didn't have this pink tint on them and all that. No, actually, where my mind jumped to was, is that a child version of Toriel? Now, since everyone else didn't seem to think that, I don't see anyone else who thought that at the time. Everyone seemed to think it was Azrael, and in fairness, I couldn't imagine how it would be a child version of Toriel. I thought that seemed a bit out there, and I thought, okay, right, what they're saying makes more sense, and I seem to be the only one who thought that, so maybe that's just, I was wrong. And I hadn't thought about that in a long, long time, because that was just something I thought at the start, and then I was like, oh, never mind, I was wrong, and I disregarded it. However, I will admit, when rewatching that video debunking the sort of Azrael is Ralsei theory, they had a whole section talking about how they feel like Toriel has more similarities to Ralsei than Azrael, if anything. And while I would say they both have about the same amount of similarities, I had never thought about it like that, I'll give it to them. I hadn't actually considered how similar Ralsei and Toriel are. So genuinely, part of me wonders if it might not be too out there to think that maybe it might even be related to Toriel. Especially considering whatever happens in Chapter 3, it looks like Toriel might be involved this time. And I'm not gonna lie, I do feel like it is the least likely that the Azrael is not Ralsei theory and that Ralsei is literally just a Darkner with nothing weird or special about him. I think it's plausible, but I do feel like it's the least likely. And this reason might sound like bullshit, but I'm gonna explain quite thoroughly why I think that this is a pretty good reason actually throughout the rest of this video. And that is, what would the point of Ralsei, a character who is very clearly made to look like, talk like, act like, and have a name that is an anagram of Azrael, and then have them not only not be Azrael, but not even be in any way related to Azrael, not even in the slightest bit? What would the point of that be? So I know that your instant reaction to that might be, oh, come on, where are the facts? Where are the hard facts? Where do I get my epic proving exactly how all the other idiots are wrong about their theories? But, like, seriously for a second, let's actually think about this. Don't you think it's a little bit weird that there are a lot of people out there that treat making theories on Undertale and Deltarune like making theories on the FNAF timeline or something? Like, I think we can all acknowledge, right, that making a theory for something like FNAF is going to be very different from making a theory for something like Undertale or Deltarune. We don't get presented with near as many hard facts in Undertale or Deltarune, and we don't get much in the way, except for occasionally Ghast-related stuff, of like secret ciphers and messages that we have to uncover and get the dates right and figure out the timeline to understand the grand overarching plot. Not that that has no place in Undertale and Deltarune, but usually it's a lot more about thematic stuff. And that's ultimately because games are art. And usually art has some kind of message or meaning. I certainly think Toby Fox treats his games like an art. I don't think you'd put so much care into it otherwise. And it's not exactly a secret that Deltarune is something that Toby Fox has wanted to do for a really, really long time, longer than Undertale. So whatever it is that Deltarune is going to be when it is complete is something that he would have wanted to do for years, and is probably what he expects to be his magnum opus. So if that is true, obviously he probably cares an awful lot about the storytelling. And I mean, let's just be real here. I do not believe for a second that Toby Fox would make Ralsei's name an anagram of Asriel for no reason, except haha, it's an epic Undertale reference. Again, I don't think it necessarily proves that Ralsei literally is Asriel. Again, I'm open to the idea it might be something a bit more abstract than that. But the idea that this was just done as an epic Undertale reference with nothing else to it is kind of stupid to me. I must admit, there's a point in the video debunking this whole thing which I just find borderline ridiculous, where they try and make the argument that when they try and pull the big reveal of, you know, Ralsei at least looking a lot like Asriel and revealing themselves at the end of chapter 1, they tried to say, oh, yeah, of course Susie was surprised. You know, I didn't expect him to look like that either. It doesn't mean he's like Asriel and all that. And it's like, well, fair enough, maybe he's not Asriel, but like, I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be important. Clearly the game kind of stops and like has a moment to show you, gasp, this is what he looks like. He looks like blank. And in fairness, most people put Asriel in that blank. And again, I can accept the idea that maybe it's not Asriel, but I just find the idea that, again, it's literally supposed to be nothing. It's just supposed to be, oh, I didn't expect that person to look like that. Moving on is kind of stupid to me. I need to get off of this because I'm being a bit mean to the original video now, and I mentioned I didn't really want to get into that. But I'm hoping you can see what I mean. It just kind of feels like a bit of a cope. You know, a great example, which I definitely did not steal from another YouTuber called Patricia Taxon, is if you look at the comment section of Jack Stauber songs. I'm sure that you've all heard of them. A lot of these songs being, well, music with weird lyrics and weird shit going on the screen that can be interpreted in multiple different ways, have people in the comments making their little theories and interpretations. And some people hate this shit. I personally don't mind it. But I definitely agree that there are some people who try to turn every single one of his songs into some kind of FNAF-style conspiracy where there's an exact concrete laid out plot where this person did this exact thing, as we can see from this extremely vague line that suggests something like that but not really that in the song. Bumblebees Are Out is one of the worst for this. There are so many people who make very, very, very specific theories with basically no evidence based off that song, but they sort of follow the vibes that song is clearly trying to convey. And I mean, the point here is that a lot of these comments that try to turn it into some kind of FNAF theory, while I personally don't really have anything against them, I do agree that they kind of miss the point of the music. The point isn't to make some kind of tinfoil hat concrete story about what the song is really about. The point is that whatever the story of the song is supposed to be about is probably going to be vague on purpose, so that it doesn't feel like it can't be applied to your life. However, the vibes are what's important. The message of the song is what's important. And honestly, I think it's a similar deal here with Undertale and Deltarune. I think Undertale and Deltarune often keep things extremely ambiguous or mysterious on purpose because there isn't supposed to be a definitive answer. And while if we can figure out a definitive answer, then go ahead, I don't have a problem with it. When we pretty clearly can't, I kind of hate to see people just find one interpretation and just say, now that's the only interpretation that's allowed. And I especially find it disappointing considering, I mean, I think I've made it pretty clear, I feel like if Ralsei really is just a Darkner with no special weirdness going on, no twist here, then I really gotta ask, what would the point of Ralsei be? I feel like he would have so little impact on the story in that case. Unless it turns out the Ralsei is evil theory turns out to be true. And in that case, I almost think that's even worse, because God, that's really boring and predictable. If anything, I feel like that would wipe away a lot of the depth that the character has developed, unless it's some very understandable motivation. Anyway, so getting back on topic, a lot of the reason why I favor a lot of these other theories a lot more, despite the fact that I can agree that they have some weak points where there's some question marks and we don't really know, is because I feel like almost all these theories could have a much more coherent message, which seems to fit with what the game's been conveying so far. So unfortunately, before I can start talking about my interpretations of what the potential messages of the game could be if the other theories are true, I will have to talk about what I think we have seen conveyed through Deltarune so far. There are a few things that are too vague that I'm going to leave out, but just the stuff which I feel like I have a pretty good argument for and that I feel like aren't going to be too controversial, I'm going to get the basics down and we're going to build off of that. So I guess the first thing I'll go for is what I feel like is probably going to be one of my strongest and least disagreeable points. I don't think it's going to be too controversial for me to say it's very likely the Dark World is supposed to represent fantasy. I mean, not just in the fact that it is literally a world which seems to be made from their imagination, at least that's the suggestion with the whole toys everywhere, that's obviously kind of like step one of getting through Deltarune and trying to interpret it. But in literally this idea that darkness exists to serve lightness and that we need to have a balance of dark and light. Ultimately, I think there's a very simple message here about the idea of having a balance between fantasy, which I think, in some ways we could call the internet. I mean, clearly that's what it is in the second Dark World in Chapter 2, and obviously the real world, the light. I don't think that's going to be too controversial to say. The second point I'm going to make is less about a message and just a general point about the game. In that, generally, considering that I think Toby knows there are a lot of young teenagers in the audience for Undertale and Deltarune, and knowing that, well, the game seems to take place from the perspective of teenagers, I think it's very likely that whatever the message will be is likely going to be catered towards that audience. This might sound like it's not very important right now, but again, we'll get back to that. Lastly, I don't think it's very controversial to say that Deltarune's clearly a progressive leaning. I mean, like, let's be real, we got a lesbian relationship in it. We got Susie and Noelle, and also just in general, Ralsei, whatever he may be, we stand either way. So alright, with all that said, one of the reasons why I feel like there is a decent amount of validity to the whole idea of the Asriel being Ralsei theory is because I feel like it would be very fitting if one of the reveals in the game might be that yes, Asriel is Ralsei, and yes, Asriel never went to college, and that the reason that they hid themselves away is because they might have fallen under the LGBT label and feared that they wouldn't have been accepted, which honestly sounds pretty likely to me. I mean, like, besides just look at Ralsei. There is another theory online, which is another one of those ones where you hear it and you think it sounds stupid, but you actually, look through it, and in fairness, it's got some good points. The whole theory that Toriel may be homophobic. The theory essentially points out there's a lot of suggestion that Asgore and Rudy actually got along really well, maybe a little too well, and that might actually be why Toriel has divorced Asgore in this timeline, since of course it's not the same timeline as Undertale, where of course the reason was completely different and wouldn't make sense in the world of Deltarune. And if Asriel turned out to be gay or bisexual, it would make a lot of sense for him to be worried that his own mother wouldn't accept him anymore. It'd make a lot of sense for him to want to hide away. And considering, again, it does seem like this game is supposed to be sort of catered to people who would be at that age where they're sort of figuring that out for themselves, I feel like it would make a lot of sense if that ended up being one of the sort of twists in the game. Now again, I want to make it very clear, I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen. I've never said that. Stop saying I said that. But don't you feel like it's a lot more constructive saying this is a good possibility and this could be the meaning of the game, rather than saying, no, I don't accept this. There's only one theory about this game that can be accepted, and it's the one that doesn't really have any meaning at all. Alternatively, if it turns out that the theory I feel is most likely ends up coming true, which is of course the one I mentioned where Asriel isn't literally Ralsei, but Ralsei is very clearly supposed to be a representation of Asriel in some capacity, then maybe it's the case that Chris was somewhat dependent on Asriel, and with him not being around anymore, he's been spiraling and again sort of playing with Ralsei, this sort of imaginary Asriel in the Dark World, and that he has to learn the balance between this fantasy to cope with the grief he's going through, but also balancing his life in the real world and not falling completely into the fantasy world, which would make a lot of sense considering the whole conflict is them pumping too much darkness into the world with the dark fountains, an overflow of fantasy that threatens both the fantasy world and the real world. That would also be a theory that would actually end up making thematic sense. Oh, and yeah, the Toriel one, that one's kind of wild, so I'm just not even going to touch that one. But either way, I mean, hey, maybe I'm being a bit cruel here. If someone has an idea of how there could be something really thematically relevant that still gets included with this whole idea of Ralsei not being Asriel, if there's some way you can imagine how that could lead to a really impactful message, you can tell me below, and maybe I'm just not seeing it. But again, considering rather than saying anything about Ralsei, it kind of says nothing about him, I don't see how we can really get any more meaning out of that. I guess lastly, I want to address the elephant in the room I've been ignoring this whole video. I'm not gonna lie, even though this is sort of never said, I feel like I know why it is, why some people get really aggressive about the idea that Asriel and Ralsei might be the same character. And I think you might know what it is too. There's this very weird implication that's left by that idea, which kind of is just left unaddressed in the game, and I will admit, this does set weird with me too. That being that there is sort of this implied romanticism between you and Ralsei depending on the dialogue options you pick, which is adorable if you think of Ralsei as just a completely separate character, but could have some creepy implications if they are literally your brother. I feel like there's enough ambiguity here that it could just be us overreacting, but I can't deny that, yeah, it does look a little bad. And I'll admit, it's the reason why I don't actually fully subscribe to the Asriel is Ralsei theory, because I just don't know how they're going to square that circle. Like, I don't think it's impossible, which is why I still think it's the second most likely outcome in my opinion, but I feel like they can't just not address that. But I can't even imagine how they would go about addressing that. However, if you go by the theory that, again, I mentioned I think is most likely, that Ralsei isn't literally Asriel, but a representation of Asriel, and the whole game is sort of about, you know, getting a balance of coping using Ralsei for the fact that, you know, their brother isn't around anymore, but also still dealing with the real world, then this whole, you know, romanticism between Chris and Ralsei could be sort of like a sign of it getting too much on the side of falling into the fantasy, which could fit pretty well. But yeah, I'm not going to deny the whole thing's just kind of weird, and I'm really not sure if we're supposed to be seeing these implications or not. Personally, I'm not going to lie, I mostly ignore this detail just because I feel like we're not going to get any answers either way on this until later. Like, I don't feel like we can theorize our way out of this one. I think this is just going to be a thing where at some point we're either going to have this debunked or confirmed, or it's just going to be like sitting there. And it'll be like, oh, okay. Just not going to address that, are we? Hey, it's all right. If it does happen that way, we'll just blame the Asriel and Ralsei shippers. Seriously, what the fuck? Well, anyway, I know this video was very different and a little bit all over the place, but I really wanted to talk about this. I found it really disappointing when a community shuts down all other interpretations of what is essentially a work of art because there's just this headcanon the community has that just can't be broken. Again, I feel like that more has a place in situations like with FNAF, where there is a definitive answer, at least probably somewhere in there, to what happened in that series, and the whole thing is the mystery of figuring it out. But again, Undertale and Deltarune are not FNAF. They're much more focused on emotions, vibes, feelings, and meanings than hard, cold facts and just, you know, cryptography and mystery. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you in whatever the hell the next one ends up being. Goodbye. Oh yeah, I'd also just like to quickly clarify, I do like FNAF. I'm not shitting on FNAF in this video, I just think FNAF's a good example of the kind of style of theorizing that people are applying to Deltarune and Undertale. I mean, I think that's fine for FNAF. I mean, for FNAF, that's what you're supposed to do. Anyway, I just thought I should quickly add that in at the end. We do, in fact, like FNAF here.